What would you do if a smiling flight attendant skipped your row again and served everyone around you, but not you? What if the seat you paid for, the comfort you deserved, and the dignity you carried were ignored simply because of the color of your skin? And what if the man beside you, the one quietly holding your hand, wasn't just your husband, but the CEO of the entire airline? This is not just a story about injustice. It's about the quiet power of a woman who refused to shrink, about a husband who had to choose between corporate comfort and human conscience, and about the ripple effect one moment of racism can have when the right people decide not to stay silent. Set 36,000 feet above the ground, this journey is more than a flight, it's a reckoning. So stay with us, because by the end of this story, you'll understand how a single tray of food became the tipping point for an entire industry. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. There was a scent in the air that tried to pretend everything was perfect. A blend of jasmine, polished wood, and the faint trace of citrus cleaner lingered in the cabin of Horizon Atlantic Flight HA470. First class smelled like control, like wealth, like no one raised their voice here unless it was for a toast. Dr. Camille Foster settled into seat 2A with the careful grace of someone used to carrying both expectation and exhaustion. She exhaled as the soft leather gave beneath her. Her fingers instinctively sought the silk-lined blanket folded neatly at the edge of the seat. She didn't pull it over her just yet. She wasn't ready to relax. Not yet. The Munich conference had been a success technically. Her keynote on minimally invasive valve replacements had drawn a standing ovation. 3 surgeons from Zurich had asked her to consult. A team from Johns Hopkins wanted to replicate her model. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt hollow. It had been 3 days of sharp lighting, small talk in big rooms, and the heavy expectation that came with being the only black woman on a panel of men twice her age. She had smiled through it all, spoken eloquently, answered questions that weren't really questions, listened to compliments that felt like puzzles. You're so well-spoken. You don't look like a heart surgeon. She'd heard them all. Again. Now, she just wanted to fly home. No lectures, no expectations, just 7 hours of silence above the Atlantic. A flight attendant appeared at the front of the cabin. Her uniform was immaculate, blonde bob sharp as a blade. She moved with practiced authority, glancing over her manifest with eyes that cataloged the cabin like property. She stopped at seat 1A, offering a practice smile and a flute of champagne. The passenger, a man in a Navy sports coat, barely looked up from his laptop as he accepted it. She chuckled at something he didn't say and moved on. At 2D and 2G. She offered champagne with another warm smile. Camille watched her gesture toward the in-flight menu with ease. The couple, dressed in casual designer wear, accepted the offer with laughter. It was all smooth, seamless hospitality like choreography. Then she reached Camille. The warmth in the woman's face drained like water from a punctured glass. She paused, just long enough for Camille to notice. "Boarding pass." "Please," the attendant said. Camille blinked. "Excuse me, your boarding pass," she repeated, her voice crisp. Camille angled her phone slightly and showed the QR code on her screen. Seat 2A. The attendant squinted, just for a second too long, as if searching for something that wasn't there, as if expecting it to say something else. Then, with no acknowledgement, no champagne, no welcome, she simply nodded and moved on. Camille didn't react outwardly, but inside, she felt it. The familiar sting, the unspoken question hiding behind all that politeness. How did you get here? Her name tag read Ingrid Monroe. Camille stored it away, not because she intended to use it. Not yet, but because pattern recognition had been her strength long before medical school. Another attendant approached a moment later. This one younger, maybe mid-20s, with dark curls tucked under her cap and eyes that flickered with nervous kindness. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," the girl said softly. "Would you like some champagne or sparkling water?" Camille glanced at her name tag. Talia, she read aloud. Sparkling water would be perfect. "Thank you." Talia's smile was quick, grateful. She returned moments later with the glass and a napkin folded into a crisp triangle. She placed it gently on Camille's tray. "Let me know if there's anything you need," she said. There was something in her voice genuine, as if she'd noticed the earlier exchange, as if she wanted to apologize without saying so. Camille gave her a nod, then turned back to the window. Outside, Munich was already fading beneath a soft haze. The taxi had taken them past a curtain of clouds, and now the jet waited on the runway, engines idling like a held breath. Ingrid passed again, adjusting something overhead. Her movements were swift, efficient, but her eyes skipped over Camille like she wasn't there. Camille leaned back in her seat. She closed her eyes and rested her hands on her lap. She told herself not to let it matter. She had sat in enough rooms where people looked past her. She had operated with nurses who called her sweetheart until she opened someone's chest and they realized who was leading the team. This wasn't new, but it never got easier. Camille shifted slightly, pulling the blanket over her knees. She looked down at her travel outfit, tailored black slacks, a soft gray sweater, flat leather shoes, no logos, no bold colors. The uniform of someone who wanted to move quietly, invisible, if possible. She didn't wear her hospital badge when she flew. She didn't carry the weight of her titles. No doctor embroidered on her carry-on. No flex, no reason. Still, they always found a reason to doubt. The engines roared. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The wheels pulled from the ground. As the plane lifted into the sky, Camille closed her eyes again. She told herself she would rest. Let it go. Just enjoy the flight. But something in her chest refused. Something quiet, but growing. The seatbelt sign clicked off with a chime and a hushed shift of movement swept through the first-class cabin. Camille opened her eyes slowly. She had not slept. Not really. Rest had been elusive since the boarding exchange. A small crack in the glass of her piece, but small cracks had a way of spreading. Talia passed by again with a soft smile and a whisper of a question. "Would you like a warm towel?" Camille accepted, appreciating the young attendant's energy. It reminded her of the residents she taught back home. Eager, earnest, aware of the eyes watching their every move. She could always tell when someone knew what it meant to be seen too little or too much. Ingrid returned 15 minutes later with the meal cart. The scent of roasted duck with citrus glaze, truffle risotto, and warm bread rolls drifted through the aisle like a promise. She moved briskly from passenger to passenger, confirming special meals and preferences with graceful professionalism. But when she reached seat 2A, her expression shifted again. Not hostile, just blank. Like Camille didn't register on her service radar, like she wasn't part of the ritual. Meal preference for you? Ingrid asked, flatly. Camille blinked. I pre-selected the vegetarian entree, eggplant risotto with basil reduction. Ingrid gave a tight smile, tilting her head slightly. No, that's not what's listed here. We have you down for the chicken with mushroom sauce. Camille sat up straighter. That's not possible. I always choose in advance through the Horizon app. I've had a dietary preference logged with my profile for years. Ingrid's smile did not move. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do now. The vegetarian options are spoken for. I'll bring the chicken. She didn't wait for a response. Camille sat still, her breath shallow. She stared down at the tray that was set in front of her minutes later. Steam rose from a plate she didn't ask for, didn't want, couldn't eat. She wasn't allergic. It wasn't about that. It was about being dismissed, again. Her fingers gripped the edges of the linen napkin. She unfolded it slowly and laid it across her lap like nothing was wrong. But something was. The man in 2B leaned slightly toward her. White, mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, expensive watch flashing beneath his cuff. I've taken this flight dozens of times, he said quietly. That was personal. She didn't treat anyone else like that. Camille offered a small nod. She didn't have it in her to smile. He hesitated. Do you want me to say something? She said gently. I'm used to letting it go. She hadn't meant to say that last part aloud, but once it left her lips, it settled between them like a truth neither of them could deny. The rest of the meal passed in silence. She didn't eat. She sipped water slowly and kept her gaze out the window, where darkness had swallowed the horizon whole. She thought of her mother then, of long train rides across state lines when Camille was a little girl. Her mother packed sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and carried a thermos of lemonade. They always sat upright, always spoke in low tones, always made sure their tickets were visible, ready. Camille never understood why until much later. Respectability was armor, politeness was survival, and silence. Silence was often the price of peace. Camille thought she had left that behind. She had become the top of her field, earned titles, wrote textbooks, mentored rising doctors across the country. But here, 37,000 feet above ground, with a plate of chicken she didn't ask for and a steward who saw her as a problem rather than a passenger, Camille realized something painful. You never really leave the room. The room changes, but the gaze remains the same. Talia approached again, this time kneeling discreetly by Camille's seat. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, she whispered. I saw the meal log earlier. It did say vegetarian. I don't know what happened. I'm new. I didn't want to overstep. Camille softened. Thank you for saying something. That matters more than you think. The young woman nodded, stood, and moved quickly away as Ingrid passed through the aisle again. Camille could see the shift in Talia's posture, shoulders tighter, eyes focused straight ahead. Camille exhaled. She reached for her satchel under the seat and pulled out her journal, a plain, black notebook with years of her handwriting inside, thoughts she hadn't said aloud, observations, pieces of surgical procedures written in long form, names of patients she couldn't forget. She flipped to a blank page and wrote, June 26, seat 2A Horizon, Atlantic Flight, Forum 17, another room I didn't belong in. Another name not seen. But I was here. I was here. She closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. The intercom crackled alive. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be cruising at 38,000 feet for the next several hours." The captain's voice was calm, confident. "Weather is clear. Expected arrival at JFK right on schedule. Sit back and enjoy the flight." Camille thought about texting Elias. Just a brief message, something vague, something neutral. But what would she say? "Your airline, your crew, your company, and I was treated like a problem in seat 2A. It wasn't fair." Elias had worked for years to build Horizon from the inside out. He had fought for reforms, created scholarship programs, mentored dozens of pilots and engineers of color. Camille knew the weight he carried, but still, how could she sit beside him tonight and not say something a part of her didn't want to? Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want to take this with her, this feeling of being less than, of being tolerated, of being erased politely. But silence wasn't working anymore. She tucked the journal back into her bag and closed her eyes again. She remembered something her mentor once said in medical school. If your presence in a room doesn't challenge the room to grow, then you've made yourself small. Camille didn't want to be small anymore. Not here, not tonight, not ever again. Camille did not know his name, but the man in 2B had been watching quietly since boarding, not in the way that made her feel vulnerable, just observant, the way physicians watched monitors, the way seasoned teachers listened for what wasn't being said. He looked like the kind of man who made deals over golf, who remembered steakhouse reservations but forgot birthdays, expensive cufflinks, slight tan lines, a Mont Blanc pen clipped to his inner jacket. But beneath the practiced calm in his posture, Camille could feel it, an alertness that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with attention. He leaned toward her again now, as Ingrid passed through the cabin with dessert. "You handled that better than most," he said. Camille raised an eyebrow. "Most?" He gave a half shrug. "I've seen people yell over smaller things, lose their temper, threaten lawsuits. You just stayed still." Camille turned back to her window. "Maybe I was tired, or maybe I've had enough practice being ignored politely." There was a pause. "I'm sorry that happened," he said. She didn't respond. A moment later, he extended a hand. "Miles Granger." She shook it. "Camille Foster." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Dr. Foster." She nodded. "Camille Foster, cardiothoracic surgeon. Worked at 3 of the top 10 teaching hospitals in the country. Published researcher. Named to 2 national surgical boards. And yet, on this flight, her value had been reduced to a missed entree." Miles nodded slowly, more to himself than to her. "I thought I recognized your name. My wife's in pharma, big fan of your valve reconstruction technique. Saved her uncle's life, actually." Camille blinked. That was new, gratitude from a stranger, genuine, quiet, and yet her stomach twisted. Because even here, recognition came not because of who she was, but what she had proven. Credentials first, humanity second. "I'm glad he's doing well," she said. Miles looked at her with a gentleness that didn't match his business exterior. "Can I ask you something?" Camille hesitated, then nodded. "Does it ever wear you down?" He didn't clarify what it was. He didn't need to. "Yes," she said, "but the work lifts me up more than it breaks me down. Usually." That one word hung in the air like smoke. "Usually." Ingrid returned then, pushing the dessert trolley with that same sterile expression. Chocolate mousse or fresh fruit plate, Camille requested tea. She didn't want sugar, didn't want sweetness. She wanted stillness. Ingrid turned to Miles, and for the first time, her expression broke into something warmer, familiar. "Miles," she said, eyes lighting up. "Didn't know you were on this route." "Back from Zurich again?" Camille blinked. She knew him. "Business," Miles said, gesturing vaguely. "You know how it is." Ingrid smiled. "Always working. Let me guess. Scotch later." "You know me too well," he said, his tone effortless. They exchanged a short laugh, and she moved on. Camille watched the interaction in silence. A connection, familiarity, the kind of grace that came with name recognition and status. Miles hadn't even asked for anything and was already being offered more than she had received in the last 2 hours. That's how it works. Isn't it? Camille thought. The rules are just softer around certain people. The lights dimmed slightly for rest. Some passengers leaned back, adjusting their seats into bed mode. A quiet cocoon of first-class sleep began to form, but Camille couldn't join them. Her mind was buzzing, not with rage, not even frustration, but a sharp, cold clarity. She hadn't told Elias, still hadn't texted, not because she was afraid of how he'd react. No, Elias had never been the kind of man to raise his voice or diminish her pain, but because she didn't want this to become about him. She didn't want her worth validated by the fact that her husband ran the airline. That wasn't the point. The point was, it should have mattered who she was long before anyone connected her name to him. Camille looked down at her phone, still in airplane mode, no messages, no distractions. She stared at the screen and saw her reflection in the black glass. Calm. Still, but tightness sat just beneath her collarbone, like a stitch that had been pulled too hard. Miles turned toward her again, this time with a softness in his voice. "I hope you do tell someone, even if it's not him. That was wrong." She nodded slowly. "I will, but not tonight. Tonight I'm trying to find rest, not justice." He gave a small smile. Sometimes rest is the first step to justice. The words lingered. In the quiet, Camille finally reclined her seat, pulled the thin blanket over her knees, and closed her eyes. But her mind wandered. She thought about the medical student she mentored last spring. Zara, 23, brilliant, black, terrified of being labeled difficult. Camille had told her, once, that silence was not always strength, that being professional didn't mean being invisible. She thought she believed that, but tonight she wasn't so sure. She felt invisible, decorated, credentialed, but invisible. And then came a voice, familiar, confident, disarming, over the PA system. "This is your captain speaking. Just a note to our crew. I'll be stepping out shortly to speak with a few passengers before final approach. Thank you for keeping the cabin steady." Camille sat up. She knew that voice. She had heard it on wedding vows, on voicemails sent from runways, on late-night calls when the miles between them felt heavier than the hours. It was Elias. She hadn't realized this was his scheduled route. She thought he was in D.C. for a board review. Suddenly, everything shifted. Not because she expected him to fix it, but because she didn't want this version of her, the weary version, to be the one he saw. Miles noticed her reaction. Something wrong. Camille shook her head slowly. No, just unexpected. Moments later, Elias stepped into the cabin, not in uniform, not with ceremony, just a man in navy trousers, a pressed white shirt, and the kind of presence that turned heads without trying. He moved calmly through the aisle, checking quietly on elderly passengers in rows 1 and 3. pausing to nod at a child traveling alone with an airline escort. And then he saw her. His eyes softened immediately. "Camille," he said gently, surprise and quiet warmth in his voice. "I didn't know you were on this leg." "Neither did I," she said. He crouched slightly beside her seat. "Everything all right?" Camille opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked over at Miles, then down at the tray table, then finally into her husband's eyes. There was so much she could say, so many ways she could let him carry it for her, but she didn't want that, not yet. "Just tired," she said. He studied her for a long moment, and she knew, from the way his jaw tensed just slightly, that he could tell there was more. "I'll come back before descent," he said softly. She nodded, and he rose, continuing his quiet path through the cabin. As he moved, Ingrid caught sight of him. Her posture changed immediately. Eyes wide, smile too sharp, too late. Recognition lit her face like a warning flare. Camille leaned back. Now, she thought, now the room knows who I am. But it shouldn't have taken this. It never should. When the dessert service ended and the lights dimmed fully, Camille didn't sleep. She rested her head against the window, but her mind refused to quiet. Thoughts spilled like ink in water, slow at first, then impossible to contain. She wasn't thinking only about the meal anymore. It had become something else, a mirror, reflecting every time she'd smiled through condescension, diffused hostility with grace, or politely declined to correct a mispronunciation of her name. Camille Foster. Not Camilla, not Miss, not the lady in 4A. It was never about the meal. It was about the dismissal, the silent categorization, the invisible decisions that were made about her before she even sat down. She opened her phone and started typing, not to Elias, to herself. A note, dated and time-stamped. Passenger 4A denied standard service while seated in paid first class. Attendant failed to apologize. No accommodation offered until witnessing a social relationship with another passenger. Cabin tone shifted only after executive presence revealed. She saved it. Then, finally, she let her eyes close. It was not sleep that followed, but a kind of emotional suspension, a limbo state between calm and clarity. She wasn't at peace, but she had paused the need to fix anything for now. Somewhere during that silence, a soft voice returned. "Dr. Foster." It was Miles again, whispering across the aisle. "Yes." He tilted his head slightly, as if unsure whether to speak. "You don't seem surprised he's the captain." Camille exhaled through her nose. "I'm not. He used to fly this route every month, but still, you didn't mention it earlier." Camille turned to face him fully this time. "Because I wanted to be seen without his shadow, to be treated according to what I earned, not who I married." Miles nodded slowly. "That makes sense, more than you know." She raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" He hesitated. "My daughter, she's 16, biracial. Her mom and I are separated, but she lives with me part-time. And every time I go to her school, people assume I'm a donor parent or guardian, not her dad." Camille blinked, surprised. They never say it outright, but the glances, they ask without asking. I see her shrinking a little, even when she smiles, like she's making space for the assumptions. There was silence between them, but not awkward silence. It was shared. "That's the thing," Camille said softly. "We grow up learning how to adapt to the doubt, to soften our presence before it threatens the room." Miles looked down at his hands. And people like me grow up not even noticing that there's a room to threaten. That acknowledgement was rare. She didn't thank him, not because she wasn't grateful, but because some truths simply needed to sit unwrapped between people. There was a rustle near the front of the cabin. Ingrid and Talia had returned, checking seatbelts ahead of descent. Talia moved gently, offering water and soft smiles. Ingrid, by contrast, looked like she was calculating her next 10 steps. Her eyes flicked to Camille, lingered a half-second longer than necessary, then moved on. Camille watched her go, and this time she didn't feel small. She felt clear. When Elias returned, he didn't enter with fanfare. He crouched beside her again, same as before, his voice low and steady. "We'll be descending in about 20. I have a break between flights in New York. Want to get a late lunch or early dinner?" Camille studied him. His calmness was part of why she loved him. But tonight she needed to see something else too, something sharper, something that said, "I see what they did to you and I'm not okay with it either." She didn't speak right away, and he noticed. "Cam, what happened?" Her hand hovered over the armrest. Her voice dropped. "I was ignored, disregarded, then politely dismissed, until Ingrid realized who I was, or, more importantly, who I was married to." Elias's jaw flexed. "Did she say anything to you?" "No apology, no eye contact, nothing, not until you came into view." He stood slowly, breathing deeply through his nose. "Where is she?" Camille reached for his hand. "Wait." He froze. "If you confront her now, in front of the passengers, it becomes about your power, not my experience. I want this handled, but it needs to come from me." Elias looked at her, the way he did in the rare moments when she overruled him in a boardroom discussion or called him out in a private setting, with respect and restraint. "Okay," he said quietly. "What do you want?" "I want to write a formal letter. I want it logged, not buried, and I want her supervisor, not you, to respond." Elias nodded. "Done." Camille added, "And I want to know what your airline's training includes for recognizing unconscious bias." His eyes widened just slightly. A touch of guilt flashed there. "We're revising that module, but we haven't implemented the new version yet." "That's not good enough." "I know." He paused. "Do you want me to step back from this entirely?" She smiled softly. "No, I want you to do your job, but I also want to be more than the woman people apologize to after they learn your name." Elias crouched again, took her hand, kissed her fingers. "You're more than that. Always have been." The words didn't fix anything, but they grounded her. As the landing announcement played, Camille took a deep breath. The city lights flickered below. Her reflection returned in the window, not tired anymore. Still, alert, but stronger. She stood as the plane taxied. Passengers retrieved their bags and coats. Ingrid passed by one last time, barely making eye contact. Camille stopped her with a word. "Excuse me." Ingrid turned, startled. "Yes, I didn't receive a meal during this flight, despite sitting in a paid first-class seat." Ingrid blinked. Her mouth opened, then closed. "I'll make a note of it." "No, I will." Camille held up her phone. The note open, time stamped. "And for your information, I'm a surgeon. My title is Doctor, not ma'am, not the lady. Dr. Foster." Ingrid's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Thank you for the feedback," she said stiffly. Camille didn't respond. She didn't need to. As she stepped off the plane, Elias walking beside her in silence, she felt something release, not victory, not revenge, but presence. She had named it. And names have weight. The jet bridge hummed with movement. Camille stepped into the terminal, heels clicking softly against polished tiles, each step echoing in her chest louder than it did in the hallway. She didn't look back at the plane. She didn't need to. Elias walked beside her but gave her space. Their fingers didn't intertwine. There were no whispered reassurances. Only presence. That, for now, was enough. They reached the arrivals area where signs blinked gently over customs and baggage claim. Elias's security escort waited by the escalators, but he waved them off. He turned to Camille instead. "Do you want me to come with you to the hotel?" She shook her head. "I want to take a walk first, clear my head. It's close to midnight. I know." His eyes studied hers. "You sure? Yes." He nodded once. "You'll text me." Camille didn't answer right away. She just tilted her head toward the city beyond the glass, her lips curving with the ghost of a smile. Always. She turned, coat tied around her shoulders, and walked toward the taxi stand. But she didn't take a cab. She didn't even leave immediately. Instead, she found a quiet bench in a corner of the terminal and sat down. There was something about airports always in motion, yet strangely still. Strangers moving around each other like silent actors on an infinite stage. She loved that part, the in-between, the transit, not the departure or arrival, but the middle, the part no one pays attention to. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Hi, this is Talia. I hope it's okay. I got your name from the passenger manifest. I just wanted to say I saw what happened, and I'm sorry." Camille blinked, staring at the screen. "There was a second message, if it helps at all. I've only been working on flights for 6 months, but I'm learning. And you taught me more in one quiet evening than any of our modules ever did." Camille's breath caught unexpectedly. She typed back slowly, "Thank you. It does help. Don't let silence become comfort. It never is." Talia replied with a heart emoji. That was all. Camille put her phone down, closed her eyes, and leaned back. And suddenly she was 16 again. A teenage girl in a high school biology class. The only black girl in the room. The teacher had called her by the wrong name for the 3rd time. Caramel. She had corrected him the first 2 times. The 3rd time, she simply looked down at her lab worksheet and said nothing. After class, her lab partner, a white boy named James, had asked, "Why didn't you correct him?" She had shrugged and said, "It's easier." James had looked confused, "But isn't your name important?" Camille had paused. "It is. But I'm tired of fighting over the small things." Now, decades later, on a cold bench in a glowing terminal, Camille realized something. It was never a small thing. The memory sat with her for a moment like an old friend returning unannounced. She exhaled slowly. The phone vibrated again. This time, it was from Elias. "You sure you're okay?" She smiled, getting there. He didn't respond with words. Just a photo. Their wedding day. Camille in an ivory silk gown with tiny pearls along the waist. Elias in a navy blue suit and tie, standing beneath a trellis of white roses. He had tears in his eyes. She had her hand on his chest. She stared at it for a long time. And then she saved it to a new album on her phone labeled Anchor. A breeze drifted through the terminal as automatic doors opened and closed with the rhythm of tired travelers. Camille stood and walked through them. Outside, the New York air kissed her cheeks with a chill. She walked to the curb and hailed a cab, finally ready for the silence of a hotel room. As she rode through the city, her mind wandered. She thought about how easily things unravel, how being unseen isn't just painful, it's dangerous. It teaches you to disappear before others ask you to. It conditions you to smile in return for crumbs. And worst of all, it convinces you that asking for decency is asking for too much. She didn't want that for the younger version of herself anymore. She didn't want it for the Talias of the world either. When the taxi stopped in front of the hotel, Camille stepped out, paid in cash, and pulled her carry-on behind her. The lobby was quiet, the late-night concierge barely looking up as he handed her the room key. Room 1204. She took the elevator alone. Inside the room, Camille didn't turn on the lights right away. She let the city glow seep through the curtains, wrapping her in soft amber. She sat on the bed, pulled out her laptop, and opened a blank document, titled First Class and the Weight of Silence. She started writing, not an angry letter, not a list of demands, a story, her story. From the moment she stepped onto flight HA417 to the moment she exited it. Every look, every omission, every instinct that told her to stay quiet, and every reason she no longer would. She included Talia's message. She included her conversation with Miles. She included the moment Elias knelt beside her like a stranger who remembered. She wrote until her hands ached. Then she read it back. Not for errors, for truth. It was all there. Her pain, her pause, her poise. She added one more paragraph at the end. I didn't speak because I was afraid of being labeled. Loud, angry, entitled. But tonight, I realize silence isn't noble. It's inherited. It's learned. And it must be unlearned. She hit save. Tomorrow she would send it to Horizon Atlantic's Director of Passenger Experience. Not as the wife of Elias Foster, CEO, but as Dr. Camille Foster, paying customer and professional woman who had been treated like luggage instead of a person. She closed the laptop, removed her jewelry, washed her face, slipped into the cool hotel sheets, and as she drifted off to sleep, she whispered something she hadn't said in a long time, out loud, just for herself. I am not invisible. Morning sunlight painted golden streaks across the hotel room walls. Camille woke slowly, the weight of sleep still wrapped around her shoulders. The hum of the city drifted up from the street below, soft and steady, like a memory returning. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring down at her hands. They were strong hands, surgeons' hands, hands that had held the beaten hearts of strangers and coaxed them back to life. But last night, those same hands had sat folded in her lap while she was told no. No to a meal, no to dignity, no to being seen. Not again. She reached for the laptop. The document was still open. She scrolled through it once more, checking not for grammar or spelling, but clarity. There was one section she hadn't written yet. The hardest part. She took a breath and typed. I never expected a glass of sparkling water to carry so much weight, but when you're the only black woman in first class and everyone else has champagne, you begin to wonder what else you weren't offered, not because it wasn't available, but because someone decided you didn't belong. She stared at the words, let them settle like sediment in her chest, and hit save. Camille sent the document to the Horizon Atlantic Passenger Relations inbox, CCing the General Counsel's office, not with threats, with truth, calm, complete, and irrefutable. Her phone buzzed an hour later. Elias. He was already in the hotel lobby. Camille changed into jeans, a soft sweater, and low-heeled boots. Her makeup was minimal today. No performance, no mask. She was done shrinking. When she stepped out of the elevator, Elias stood and held out her coffee, just the way she liked it, almond milk, light foam, 2 sugars. "Thanks," she said, taking a sip. "How are you feeling?" Like someone who doesn't need to apologize for asking to be treated like everyone else. He nodded. "Good." They walked outside and fell into a natural rhythm. Camille noticed he was quieter than usual, not withdrawn, just thoughtful. He spoke first. "I read your letter. You weren't on the CC, I know, but legal forwarded it immediately. It's already making waves." Camille sipped her coffee. "That's not why I wrote it. I know." They turned a corner. The sidewalk buzzed with morning energy business people rushing with briefcases, a woman selling flowers from a cart, children tugging at backpacks as they headed toward school. Camille paused to watch them. You ever wonder, Elias, how many of us learn to make ourselves smaller just to stay in rooms that were already too tight all the time? He said quietly. "I've seen it. In boardrooms, in airports, in my own damn house." Camille looked at him. Elias met her gaze. "I've seen you shrink yourself, Camille, and I didn't always stop you, or even notice." That admission surprised her, but more than that, it moved her. They reached a park bench just outside a quiet cafe and sat. A breeze moved through the trees, fluttering leaves like applause. "I didn't marry you to protect you," Elias said. "I married you because you were the most whole, grounded person I'd ever met. I just hate that you've had to protect yourself even from the people who were supposed to serve you." Camille placed her coffee on the bench beside her. "You know, when I was in residency, there was this attending who never remembered my name, kept calling me Cassandra. One day I corrected him. He said, 'Same difference.' That's when I knew it wasn't about memory. It was about erasure." Elias let out a low breath, and you still rose above it. "I didn't rise. I adjusted. That's what people don't understand. Resilience isn't a choice. It's the only option when silence is survival." A pause passed between them. Camille turned slightly. "Did I embarrass you yesterday?" Elias frowned. "What with the letter, with the attention, with the fact that now half your leadership team is scrambling?" He shook his head slowly. "Camille, I'm not embarrassed by your voice. I'm embarrassed it took this long for people to hear it." She looked down, blinking. For the first time in a while, the tears that welled up weren't from pain. They were from release. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "This came to my office this morning." She unfolded it. It was handwritten. A note from a teenage girl named Ayanna Harper, a passenger in economy. She'd seen Camille in the gate area and had wanted to say something but was too shy. After the in-flight incident, she wrote, "I don't know if I'll ever be able to sit in first class. But knowing someone like you was there, even if they didn't treat you right, made me feel like maybe one day I could belong there too." Camille closed her eyes. She held the letter to her chest, heart swelling. Sometimes you don't realize who's watching, who needs you to simply stand tall so they can believe it's possible. Elias took her hand. Not performatively, just solid, present. "What happens next?" he asked. Camille thought for a moment. "You let the process work, investigate, discipline who needs it, train the rest, and, more than anything, listen. not just to passengers, but to your staff, especially the ones who've learned to stay quiet. He nodded. Done. Also, she added, I want to meet with Ingrid, the lead attendant. Elias arched a brow. Are you sure? Yes. Not out of anger. I just want to look her in the eye and ask her why. Not to shame her. To make sure she sees me. And maybe, just maybe, the next Camille who boards her flight won't have to be seen through the lens of suspicion or hierarchy, just as a person, a full, complex, worthy person. They sat there quietly, letting the city unfold around them. There would be press inquiries, social media speculation, internal memos, but Camille wasn't worried about any of that. What mattered was the echo she refused to let fade. That quiet moment where someone chose to speak instead of swallow. That moment was now. Camille stood just outside Gate 14A the next afternoon, not as a surgeon, not as the CEO's wife, not even as the woman who'd just shaken the airline industry. Today, she was just a passenger. But this time, she was choosing the seat, choosing the moment, choosing not to disappear. Elias had offered her a quiet room, a private lounge, even a town car waiting directly on the tarmac. She had politely refused them all. This meeting had to be on neutral ground. Inside the glass-walled conference room beside the boarding area, Ingrid Monroe sat waiting. Her uniform was crisp, her posture erect. But Camille saw the nervous twitch of her fingers against the paper coffee cup she clutched like a lifeline. When Camille entered, Ingrid rose to greet her, eyes uncertain. Dr. Foster, she said softly. Camille offered a calm nod. Ms. Monroe. They sat. The room was quiet except for the hum of nearby departure announcements and the distant clatter of suitcase wheels. A fragile silence settled between them. Camille let it sit a moment longer. She'd learned over years of working with grief-stricken families and emergency decisions that silence often spoke louder than apologies. Do you know why I wanted to meet you? She finally asked. Ingrid's gaze dropped. Because you're angry. No, Ingrid looked up. Because I'm tired. Tired of being expected to just take it. To internalize every slight, every moment someone decides they know who I am before I speak a word. Ingrid hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. I didn't mean for it to. You didn't think it mattered, Camille said quietly. You saw a black woman in first class and you made a decision. You assumed, you categorized, and you withheld something that was never yours to deny. Ingrid's face flushed. I've been working in this industry for 27 years. I've dealt with every kind of passenger imaginable. Sometimes we're juggling a dozen requests, dietary changes, turbulence, attitude you didn't forget. Camille interrupted. The meal wasn't out of stock. It wasn't an emergency. You looked at me and decided I didn't belong. Ingrid flinched. Her grip on the coffee cup tightened. Camille's voice softened, but her eyes remained firm. Have you ever been invisible, Ms. Monroe? I don't mean ignored. I mean systematically unseen, reduced to a seat number, or worse, a stereotype. Ingrid swallowed hard. I've worked with diverse passengers my whole life. I've never, Camille raised a hand gently. I'm not here to collect your resume. I'm here to ask a single question. Ingrid blinked. Why me? The question hung in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. Ingrid opened her mouth, closed it. Her lips trembled slightly, but no sound came. Camille waited. After what felt like a full minute, Ingrid whispered, I don't know. Camille exhaled, not with victory, but with understanding. "That's the problem," she said. "You don't know, and because you don't know, you move on, and I carry it. Every unspoken assumption, every micro-decision that says, 'You're not quite welcome here.'" Ingrid's eyes were glassy now. "I didn't see it that way. I swear, I didn't. I believe you. That's what makes it so dangerous." Another silence passed, but this one felt different. Not heavy, not blaming, just real. Camille stood slowly. "I didn't come here to shame you, Ms. Monroe. I came here to make sure you remember my face, not the name you read on the passenger manifest. My face, my presence, my humanity." Ingrid's voice was barely audible. "I do. I will." Camille nodded once and opened the door. Just before leaving, she turned back. "What you do next matters more than anything you say today." Ingrid gave a slight nod. Outside, Elias stood near the coffee kiosk, arms crossed gently, his face unreadable but watching. When Camille reached him, he stepped forward, instinctively reaching for her hand. She let him hold it. "How'd it go?" he asked. She didn't lie. "It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was a start. She saw me, maybe for the first time." "That's enough for today," he said. "Not quite," she replied, and led him toward a different gate. They boarded the return flight not as a statement, but as a choice. Camille took her seat in 2A, Elias beside her in 2B, the same configuration, a new atmosphere. As boarding continued, a young black flight attendant with warm eyes and impeccable posture approached. "Dr. Foster," she asked, her voice gentle. "Yes, my name's Talia Ramos. I just wanted to say I read your letter. Twice. I cried the second time. You said something I've never been able to put into words. Thank you." Camille smiled, warmth flooding her chest. "Thank you for saying that." Talia leaned in slightly. "We're going to do better. You have my word." The flight was calm, uneventful, quiet, but not in the way it had been before, not hollow. This quiet held acknowledgement, intention, care. Camille watched out the window as the city below shrank into a quilt of moving lights and tiny squares. She had spent a lifetime striving to be seen in institutions that hadn't been built for her. But, for the first time, she felt the shift begin, not through confrontation, but clarity. Elias turned to her mid-flight. "I think we need to do more than just fix this." "What do you mean?" "I mean systemic, permanent, not just apologies and retraining. A real shift, the kind that holds leadership accountable, that promotes people like Talia, that rewrites the rules of service and respect." She studied him. "Are you ready for the blowback?" He gave a small smile. "I'm married to you, Camille. I've been preparing for courage since the day you said yes." She laughed softly, the sound rich with disbelief and affection. "You sure you're not just trying to impress me before the press conference?" "Oh, absolutely." He grinned. "But also, I mean it." They sat back, hands loosely intertwined between them, not as symbols of power or statements of change, but simply as partners, as people who understood that transformation wasn't a destination, it was a discipline. Camille leaned her head against the window. For once, the clouds looked like possibilities, not barriers. She closed her eyes and let herself breathe. It had been 6 weeks since Flight 498, but Camille still felt its weight each time she stepped into a terminal. Not as dread, exactly. More like a shadow she was learning to walk beside instead of run from. She sat in a windowed conference room inside Horizon Atlantic's executive wing, watching as the last of the board members took their seats. Outside the glass, planes lifted and landed like clockwork, oblivious to the slow dismantling happening inside these walls. Elias sat at the head of the table, shoulders calm, expression unreadable. Camille sat beside him, not in the capacity of a silent spouse, but as a co-author of what was about to happen. They had called it a listening session on the internal memo, but everyone in the room knew it was more than that. The airline's VP of brand strategy cleared his throat. "Dr. Foster, thank you for joining us and for everything." Camille nodded politely. She had prepared no speech, no slides, just the truth. A few rows down sat Talia Ramos, now promoted to first-class cabin liaison, a new position Elias had created after Camille's proposal. She looked composed, but her hands were folded tightly in her lap. The room quieted. Elias looked to Camille. She stood. "When I boarded Flight 498, I did so with no intentions other than to get home." She began. "I was tired. Hungry. Human. What happened on board may have seemed small to some of you." A meal withheld. A moment passed. She let the words settle, but it was a microcosm of something much larger. A truth many passengers live with but don't have the platform to name. That certain people in certain seats are always presumed to belong, and others are silently asked to prove that they do. A middle-aged board member leaned forward, hands clasped. "Are you suggesting we've trained our staff to discriminate?" Camille met his gaze evenly. "I'm suggesting that if you don't actively train them not to, then yes, that is what you've done." He looked down. She continued. "This is not about punishing one flight attendant or issuing another PR statement. This is about reshaping an institution that was designed without people like me in mind." A quiet murmur passed through the room. "Let me ask you something," Camille said, turning toward the full table now. "How many of you have ever had to consider how your skin color might influence whether you get your dinner served?" No hands rose. That's what privilege is. Not evil, not always intentional, just inherited silence. It's the water you swim in, and you forget others are holding their breath. Someone near the back cleared their throat, quietly emotional. "We talk a lot about first-class experience," she said, "about premium service and personalized care. But those words mean nothing if they aren't equally applied. You can't market luxury while silently upholding exclusion." Elias stood beside her now, not to take over, but to affirm. "We're not here to salvage reputation," he said. "We're here to rebuild trust from the ground up." Camille looked to Talia, then back at the room. "That starts with 3 commitments. Not ideas. Commitments." She clicked the remote in her hand, and a slide appeared behind her. Clear, bold, uncompromising. 1. Representation in training, hiring, and leadership must reflect the diversity of the passengers we serve. 2. A restorative accountability framework, not just punishment, must be built for incidents of discrimination, including internal mediation with impacted passengers. 3. A passenger advocacy board, composed of flyers from diverse backgrounds, will be created to review quarterly service data, complaints, and praise. Someone raised a hand. "Won't this be costly?" Camille smiled gently. "More costly than losing consumer trust, than becoming the next public failure, than losing the souls of your staff." Silence again, then, slowly, a few nods. Talia stood suddenly, not to interrupt, but because something in her couldn't stay quiet. "I've seen people cry over upgraded seats," she said, "but I've also seen people shrink when they realize they're being treated differently. We don't just serve drinks and meals. We serve safety, dignity, memory. Let's make those memories good ones." Applause began slowly, but rose quickly. After the meeting, Elias and Camille walked the length of the concourse quietly. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Take it all on." She looked over at him, eyes clear. "But I did, because I lived it, and because I could." She paused near a gate filled with young travelers waiting to board. A little black girl sat cross-legged near the window, reading a science magazine. Her mother braided her hair with one hand and held a boarding pass in the other. Camille watched them for a moment. "Do you ever wonder how many times we passed someone like that and didn't see them?" Elias looked over. "I do now." Camille smiled. "Good. That's the beginning." They reached the terminal restaurant where they'd first met almost 8 years ago. The same crooked bar stool, the same faint smell of fresh croissants and over-roasted coffee. Elias pulled out a chair for her, instinctively, a habit he'd never lost. Even as they debated boardrooms and bias, they sat across from each other, menus unopened. "What if they don't listen?" he asked quietly. "What if it fades?" Camille shook her head. "Then we speak again and again, until they can't unhear us." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "There's something else," he said. "I've been thinking about stepping down." Camille blinked. "From the board, from the CEO chair, not out of shame, but to make room. There's someone on our operations team who's ready, and she's brilliant, and she's not me." Camille studied him. "Are you sure I want to build something, not just preserve it? Sometimes that means stepping aside." Camille leaned back, letting that settle. "Let me be clear, Elias. I didn't ask for that, I know. But you taught me to see the system, not just the surface." A quiet filled the space between them, not from hesitation, but reverence. They spent the next hour talking about strategy, change, their weekend plans, and how to make pancakes without them tasting like cardboard. Normal things, human things, but underneath it all, the seat was still there, the one where Camille had sat, hungry, dismissed, and unseen. She had not changed her truth to become palatable. She had spoken it plainly, and the world around her had begun to bend, not break. She smiled to herself as she looked around the cafe. One seat had started something, but now she was building the whole table. The next flight Camille took was deliberately booked in economy. Not because she needed to, not because she had a point to prove, but because she had promised herself something after Flight 498. She would not allow first class to define her worth, nor economy to reduce it. The rows were tighter, the legroom sparse. A baby cried gently in the distance, lulled only by the quiet hum of the plane. Camille nestled into her aisle seat, cross-legged beneath a thick wool cardigan. She'd left her lab coat at home. No designer handbag, no formal introduction, no subtle performance of power. She was simply herself. She pulled out a paperback from her tote bag, a worn copy of The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. As the flight ascended into the clouds, she let her fingers trail the underlined sentences. Words she'd read in college, again in medical school, and then again just weeks ago when she needed something to tether her through the chaos. Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without, and no, we cannot live within. She had worn many masks as a doctor, as a black woman in high-stakes rooms, as a wife to a man the world expected perfection from. But on this flight, there were none, just her, a woman, traveling, the flight attendant, a young man in his early 20s with an attentive face, approached her row with the beverage cart. "Would you like something to drink?" Ma'am Camille looked up and smiled. "Water, please." He nodded. "Ice." "No, thank you." As he handed her the cup, his eyes lingered on her book. "That's Baldwin, isn't it?" "It is. My mom used to read him out loud in the kitchen, especially when she was upset." Camille tilted her head, intrigued. Did it help sometimes? Mostly. I think it just reminded her she wasn't crazy. Camille chuckled softly. "That's more powerful than we give it credit for." He gave a small, respectful nod, then continued down the aisle. She sipped slowly. The water was lukewarm, the plastic cup thin, but there was something grounding about it. After months of high ceilings, luxury lounges, and boardroom lighting, it felt honest. Halfway through the flight, a soft voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to inform you that today's flight is part of a new pilot program, celebrating our passengers with a complimentary snack experience curated by our guest advisors. Today's selection is inspired by home recipes from our very own crew families." A cart rolled down the aisle. Camille watched with quiet curiosity as the cabin filled with the warm scent of cornbread muffins and roasted almonds, tucked neatly in small paper bags stamped with the phrase, "Every seat deserves warmth." When the attendant reached her, he offered the snack with a quiet, almost reverent smile. "This one's from Talia's mom. She made the recipe herself." Camille blinked. "Talia Ramos." He nodded. "She's on the advisory board. She insisted this be the first one we try." Camille took the muffin gently, holding it like it was made of something more fragile than flour and love. Tell her thank you." The attendant's voice softened. "I think she knows." Camille leaned back in her seat and broke the muffin in half. The scent hit her memory like an old photograph Sundays on her grandmother's porch in North Carolina. The sunlight warming the wood slats, a radio playing Al Green in the distance. She ate slowly, thoughtfully, with tears she didn't realize she was shedding. Across the aisle, a little boy stared at her, curious. His mother hushed him gently, but Camille offered a smile. "It's okay," she said. "What's your name, Eli?" he whispered. "Hi, Eli. I'm Camille." "You're crying." She nodded. "I know. Sometimes food makes us remember things. Like what? Like people we love, places we miss, feelings we didn't know we still had." He seemed to think on that. Then reached into his own bag and held out a small chocolate square. "You can have mine, too." Camille accepted it with care. "That's very kind of you." "Thank you." Eli grinned, then turned back to his coloring book. The remainder of the flight passed in soft rhythm. Pages turned. Laughter murmured. A rare sense of unity wrapped the cabin in something that felt almost sacred. As the wheels touched down, applause rippled through the rows, not loud, not performative, just a quiet recognition that something simple had been made meaningful. Camille waited until the plane had nearly emptied before she stood. As she stepped into the aisle, she noticed a folded note tucked beneath her muffin bag. She opened it slowly. "Thank you for not just fighting the storm, but for teaching us how to build shelter in it." It was unsigned, but she knew. Outside the terminal, Elias waited by the car. He was wearing jeans and a plain navy sweater, looking like someone who had just taken a long walk rather than chaired a multi-billion-dollar company. He opened the passenger door for her. How was the flight? Camille smiled. Honest, grounded, real, so it worked. It did more than work. It fed people. He glanced at her hand, still holding the small chocolate square from Eli, and that a reminder that change starts small, sometimes with a muffin, sometimes with a 5-year-old's kindness. He leaned over and kissed her cheek. I'm proud of you. Camille looked out the window as the city skyline unfolded. She thought of all the times she had questioned her voice, her presence, her right to name injustice. Not anymore. That meal on Flight 498 had been more than a denial. It had been a mirror, and in its reflection she had seen the cost of silence. But now, something new was beginning. A story rewritten not in press releases or shareholder memos, but in meals served with dignity, in children offering chocolates, in women choosing to sit in economy because they wanted to, not because they had to. She rested her head against the window. We're not just passengers anymore. Elias, no, we're architects now, of what a different kind of flight. And somewhere above them, thousands of feet in the air, another passenger was being offered a muffin that tasted like home. For the rest of the flight, Camille kept her distance from the first-class galley, not out of fear, not out of defeat, but because she was thinking, deeply, strategically, emotionally. Elijah was sleeping now, not deeply, not peacefully, but it was sleep nonetheless. His hand rested gently on hers from across the armrest, not a possessive grip, a grounding one, the kind that silently asked, "Are you still here?" She didn't pull away, but she also didn't squeeze back. The cabin lights dimmed, the hushed rhythm of cruising altitude made everything feel suspended. Still, as if the plane itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Camille stood and walked slowly to the back of the first-class galley, where a small drawer held complaint cards and service forms. She pulled one out, then another, then a third. Not for drama, but because each one served a different purpose. She found a pen tucked in the edge of the beverage cart. The click echoed louder than she expected. She exhaled and leaned on the stainless steel surface, blocking the view from passengers. Her heart was strangely steady. Camille began to write. Not a complaint, not a plea, but a reckoning. The first card was addressed to the Airline Service Ethics Board. She wrote in calm, deliberate strokes, detailed her treatment, Margaret's exact words, the moment she was denied her meal, the names of the crew who stood by and said nothing. She even described the tone, the pacing, the chill in the air when the tray was pulled away as if her presence soiled it. The second card was to Elijah Croft, her husband, not her protector, not her savior, her partner, or at least the man who once promised to be. This note was shorter. She wrote about the erosion of trust, not from his silence today, but from all the times she saw things and let them go. All the moments she'd sat at charity galas, knowing the airline his board oversaw still used outdated bias training modules, that their so-called diversity initiative hadn't been updated since the last quarter, that he said he would look into it, but didn't. The third card was left blank for a long time. She wasn't sure who it was for. Maybe the passengers who had watched and stayed silent. Maybe for herself. Eventually, she wrote only one line. "If my silence makes you comfortable, Ask why. She placed all three in a clear envelope she found beside the cutlery tray, sealed it, labeled it with her name, and walked to the front of the plane. She handed it to the lead attendant. Not Margaret. The younger man with auburn hair and kind eyes who had flinched when the tray was pulled away earlier. "This is for your team and your board," she said softly. "Please make sure it reaches them." He nodded. She saw shame in his eyes. He whispered, "I'm sorry for what happened. I should have spoken up. Camille didn't scold. She didn't comfort him either. You still can," she said. "It's not too late." She returned to her seat. Elijah was awake. He looked at her hands, saw the envelope missing, and knew. "You're making it public?" he asked. "No," Camille replied. "I'm making it official." "You make it public." He flinched slightly. "I need to know," she added. "If the man I married only speaks up when cameras are rolling or when it costs him something." They sat in silence. The lights in the cabin glowed a soft blue. Somewhere across the aisle, a glass clinked gently. Someone chuckled at a movie, but at seat 2A and 2B, the atmosphere was heavier than the sky outside. "I want to fix this," Elijah said finally. "You can't fix me," Camille said. "I was never broken." She turned toward the window, but her voice remained clear. "I am not your PR incident. I'm your wife, and today you saw what it feels like to be me, to be black, to be erased in plain sight." Elijah swallowed. His throat moved like someone who hadn't spoken truth in a while. "I was scared," he admitted. "Not of Margaret, not of what people would think, but of how far I've drifted. I thought we were aligned. I thought I had done enough by supporting you quietly." Camille turned to him. "Elijah, there's no quiet justice, not anymore. Silence is an endorsement. Neutrality is a privilege. You can't sit beside me and say nothing when the world erases me in front of your face." His eyes welled, but this time she didn't soften. "You asked me to be your wife, not your cover," she continued. "You wanted to share a life, then share the cost." For a long time, they said nothing more. The seatbelt sign chimed, "Descent." Camille rested her head back and closed her eyes. Not to sleep, to feel, to let the swell of emotion pass through her without pushing it down. She remembered being a little girl on her first flight with her grandmother, sitting near the rear, watching clouds drift by and dreaming of being up front one day, not for status, but for space, for peace, for the small joy of being seen. That dream had bent over the years, had dulled under the weight of backhanded comments and long layovers in expectation. But today, in a strange and twisted way, it had become clearer again, not easier, but clearer. Camille felt Elijah's hand reach gently for hers again. She didn't move, she didn't flinch, but she didn't close her fingers either, and that, she knew, was the truth between them now. A space neither cruel nor warm, just honest. The landing gear dropped, the lights brightened, and Camille looked out the window, thinking this flight wasn't about arrival, it was about exposure. And sometimes exposure is the beginning of real elevation. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt. Camille barely reacted. She kept her gaze fixed out the window, where dawn was stretching its way across the tarmac. The rising light blurred along the edge of her vision like watercolor on wet paper. For the first time since the meal tray was pulled from her lap, she felt something close to peace. Not comfort, not closure, but peace and clarity. She knew where she stood now. not just with the airline, with herself, beside her. Elijah shifted in his seat. The movement was subtle, like a man who had spent the last hour rehearsing what to say, but still feared the weight of the silence between them. His voice came low, almost uncertain. "I don't want us to get off this plane the way we got on it." Camille blinked slowly, her head still resting against the window. "You mean as strangers?" He flinched. A soft exhale left his lips. "I meant as two people pretending this was just turbulence." Camille finally turned to face him. Her eyes were clear but tired, not just from the flight, from the years before it. "Elijah, this wasn't turbulence. This was a controlled descent." She could see the impact of her words hit him, see the way he turned them over in his mind like a man reading a language he once knew but had forgotten how to speak fluently. She wanted to believe he was trying. She really did. But trying wasn't the same as changing. The intercom crackled to life. A smooth, professional voice welcomed them to Dulles International, instructed passengers to remain seated, thanked them for choosing our airlines. The irony was almost too much. Camille stood slowly, adjusted her jacket, and reached for her carry-on from the overhead bin. Elijah remained seated, watching her. "Can we talk? Really talk?" he asked. She paused, turned back. "We've been talking. You just weren't listening." The hurt flickered across his face. She hated that she still cared. The passengers began filing out, one by one. Some glanced at her, some didn't. Most looked away. That was always easier, she knew. Easier than confronting the truth that they had watched a woman be humiliated in silence and said nothing. But someone didn't look away. Noah Anders stood by the cockpit door, arms respectfully behind his back, eyes meeting hers with something more than apology. It was resolve. "I gave your letter to the captain," he whispered as she passed, "and I asked to speak on record, too." Camille blinked, a small warmth flickering through the exhaustion in her chest. "Thank you," she said. "Genuinely. That matters more than you know." "It's overdue," he replied. She stepped off the plane. The jet bridge felt colder than she remembered, not because of the temperature, because she carried so much more now. Halfway down the corridor, she heard Elijah's footsteps behind her. "I'm not letting you walk out of here without knowing I meant what I said." She didn't stop. "Elijah," she said over her shoulder, "then you'll understand why I'm walking out anyway." He caught up beside her, matched her stride. For once, he didn't try to control the moment. He walked quietly beside her, let her lead. It was a strange reversal. The man who had once walked in front of her, casting shadows, now walked beside her, uncertain if he belonged in her light. Camille stopped at the gate's edge, where a glass wall looked out onto the sunrise stretching over distant terminals. The gold spilling across the tarmac looked like a promise she hadn't expected to receive. She turned to him. "You have work to do," she said. "I know. Not statements, not donations, not surface apologies. Real work, inside-out work. You can't outsource this." He nodded. "I want to start with the board," he offered. "Bring in external audits, cultural transformation consultants, elevate staff like Noah to training leadership, fire Margaret." Camille tilted her head. "Not because of me," she said, "because it's right." He met her eyes. This time, he didn't blink, "because it's right." There was a silence then that wasn't heavy. It was sacred. The kind of silence that stretches between two people who know the past can't be erased. But maybe, just maybe, the future can be rewritten. Camille reached into her purse and pulled out her wedding ring. She hadn't worn it on the plane. It had been resting beside a tube of lip balm and a travel-size bottle of hand lotion. She turned it in her palm. "You want to earn this back?" she asked softly. "Then don't perform for headlines. Don't protect me with your name. Stand beside me when I speak, even when it's inconvenient, especially then." Elijah reached out, not to take the ring, just to cover her hand with his. "I hear you." Camille studied him, really studied him. There was a crease in his brow she hadn't noticed before, a crack in the armor, a human being behind the perfect suit. Maybe that was all she ever wanted. Not perfection, not power, presence. He stepped back, let her hold the ring, let her choose whether it returned to her finger or stayed in her pocket. "Are you going to the press?" he asked. "I don't have to," she said. "The truth will travel on its own." They walked together toward the baggage claim in silence. This time, side by side, no touching, no posturing, just presence. Before they exited, Camille paused beside a trash bin. She looked down at the blank envelope that had held her final message. She took it out, unfolded the third note again, and read her own handwriting. "If my silence makes you comfortable, ask why." She placed the paper back inside, but instead of throwing it away, she tucked it into her coat pocket. Some truths were worth carrying. When they stepped into the main terminal, cameras weren't waiting. No one was watching. Just weary travelers pulling suitcases and families reuniting. Camille smiled faintly. Maybe justice didn't always need an audience. Sometimes it only needed two people, one to speak and one to finally listen. 6 weeks later, Camille stood at the center of a modest but well-lit auditorium inside the Langston Community Center in Washington. D.C. The air held that familiar blend of folding chairs, recycled HVAC, and simmering courage. A microphone stood before her, not because she needed amplification, but because her story deserved to be heard clearly. Every word, every pause. Rows of faces watched her. Young students, older women, airline workers who had flown in on standby, a few executives sitting stiff in their seats, eyes wide open for the first time. There was no branding, no glossy banners, just a hand-painted sign behind her that read, "Dignity is not negotiable." Camille adjusted the stack of papers in her hands, then set them down. She didn't need them. "My name is Camille Rivers. I'm a neuroscientist, a mother, and for the past 11 years, the wife of Elijah Croft, CEO of Airlines." There was a subtle intake of breath from the back rows. The words felt like thunder dressed in velvet. 6 weeks ago, I boarded Flight 728 as a paying first-class passenger. I did not receive the meal I requested. I did not receive eye contact. I did not receive an apology. Her voice was calm, measured, yet every syllable held weight. What I did receive was a silent lesson, a reminder that achievement is not immunity, that your zip code, your doctorate, your proximity to power, none of that protects you from systems that were never designed to see you. She stepped forward. Her heels clicked gently on the wood floor. Her tone softened, but her message sharpened. "You see, people think racism only shows up as a slur or a slamming door. But sometimes it's just a meal withheld, a tone used, a question asked twice. It's silence on a plane full of people who saw and chose comfort over courage." A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. Camille's gaze swept the room, resting on no one and everyone all at once. But here's what I've learned. Silence spreads fast, but so does truth. So does accountability. And if you name it, if you face it without flinching, even the most well-insulated systems have to respond. Behind her, the door opened quietly. Elijah entered alone. He didn't walk to the stage. He didn't take a front row seat. He stood at the back, beside the wall, arms folded, not as a CEO, not as a husband, but as a man who knew he had failed and was learning to stay in the hard spaces. Camille didn't acknowledge him with words, but her eyes met his for a breath. Then she turned back to the crowd. Today, I'm announcing the formation of the 2A project, named after my seat that day, not to remember the humiliation, but to reclaim it. We will advocate for unbiased training standards, real-time reporting tools for passengers, and accountability metrics for every major airline. A wave of hushed affirmations spread through the room. Because no little girl should grow up believing that her skin makes her invisible, and no woman should have to carry her husband's last name like a shield. Her voice cracked slightly, just enough to remind them she was not made of marble. She was made of memory and muscle and choice. We don't need another trending hashtag. We need policies. We need consequences. We need people inside these systems willing to break the cycle. She stepped back from the mic, giving space for her closing words to breathe. We don't fly to escape. We fly to arrive, and dignity should not need an upgrade. The room stood, not just clapping, but standing, not in a polite support, but in shared ache, in recognition. After the crowd began to filter out, Camille stepped down from the stage. She moved slowly, deliberately, collecting the quiet glances, the whispered thank yous, the warm hands pressed into hers. Change didn't come with headlines. It came with moments like this: repetition, reclamation, rest. Elijah waited until nearly everyone had gone. Then he approached. "You didn't mention me by name," he said, his voice low, almost careful. Camille nodded as she packed her notes. It wasn't your story to center. That truth hung between them like incense. But you stood there, she added, and that matters. He gave her a small, sad smile. I'm doing the internal audit. Margaret's gone. We're restructuring incentives around ethics now, not upsells. And Noah, he's leading our new training division. Camille looked up, surprised, a real one, not performative. That's a start, she said. They stood there for a moment in a quiet neither of them tried to fix. You coming home? He asked finally, the words raw. Camille took a long breath, looked out at the now empty stage, then at her own hands, then at him. Maybe, she said softly, but this time, it's not about where I live. It's about who I am when I walk in the door. He nodded. Then I'll wait. Not as a CEO, not even as your husband, just as a man hoping he's worthy. They walked out side by side, the door closing gently behind them. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched across the pavement, not blazing, not dramatic, just warm enough to remind her that healing didn't have to roar. Sometimes it just whispered. She slipped her hand into her coat pocket and felt the folded note. If my silence makes you comfortable, ask why. She unfolded it one last time. Then, instead of putting it away, she gave it to a girl sitting quietly by the exit. Maybe she would read it. Maybe she wouldn't. But maybe, just maybe, it would give her the courage to speak when the time came. Camille looked up at the sky. Some journeys don't end. They evolve. and as the light danced across the clouds above, Seat 2A didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a beginning. Camille Rivers didn't raise her voice. She didn't live stream her pain or post a single hashtag. But what she did, by simply naming the silence, by holding her ground in Seat 2A, became a ripple that touched policy, hearts, and millions of unseen travelers. This wasn't just about a meal. It was about every time someone is told to shrink, to wait their turn, to endure quiet harm just to keep the peace. Camille's story reminds us that dignity is not a privilege, it's a birthright. It's a tribute to every woman who's ever been dismissed, every person of color who's been overlooked, and every soul who's been told, it's not a big deal, but it is. And if this story made you feel seen, or made you see someone you hadn't before, then let's not stop here. Like this video to honor stories that need light. Share it with someone who still believes silence is safer. And subscribe for more stories that dare to challenge comfort, invite compassion, and rewrite what justice can look like. We'll see you in the next one. And remember, some seats come with stories that can't be measured in miles.